Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop moving. Jonah Miller had become a ghost in his own life. At 41, he moved through his days like a man underwater, every gesture requiring impossible effort, every breath a small victory. He was a maintenance technician for a supermarket chain in the Minneapolis area, the kind of man people called when something broke. And lately, everything was breaking. His mornings began in darkness. The alarm would pull him from shallow sleep at 4:30, and he'd lie there for exactly 3 minutes, staring at the ceiling, gathering the will to stand. The apartment was always cold. His father, Walter, kept the thermostat low to save money, and Jonah had stopped arguing about it months ago. He'd shuffle to the bathroom, splash water on his face, and see a stranger in the mirror. Gray stubble, eyes with dark circles so deep they looked permanent, shoulders that curved forward as if carrying an invisible weight. Which, of course, he was. The drive to work took 30 minutes through frozen suburban sprawl. Jonah would grip the steering wheel too tight, his knuckles white, radio off because even music felt like noise. His mind would run through the day's emergencies before they happened. The refrigeration unit at store 14 that kept shutting down, the electrical panel at store 7 that sparked every time it rained, the endless emails from the new supervisor, Chris Holloway, a man 15 years younger who spoke only in spreadsheets and deadline ultimatums. Work had changed. The company had laid off half the maintenance team 2 years ago, but kept the same number of stores. Jonah's territory had doubled, then tripled. Now he covered 12 locations across the metro area, each one a carnival of breaking equipment and deferred repairs. He'd arrive at a store, fix what he could with duct tape and prayer, then race to the next crisis. Lunch was whatever he could eat while driving. Dinner was whatever was left in the work truck's glove compartment. By the time he got home, usually after 9, his father would be asleep in the recliner, television flickering in the dark. Walter had suffered a mild stroke 18 months ago. Not catastrophic, the doctors said, but enough to steal some mobility, some clarity, some independence. Now he needed help with medications, with grocery shopping, with remembering which day the bills were due. Jonah's sister lived in Oregon with her own family and sent checks sometimes, but never visited. His ex-wife, Diane, had moved to Arizona with their son Mason 3 years ago for a job opportunity that turned into a new relationship. Mason was 16 now, a sophomore who communicated mostly through text messages that came less and less frequently. The exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was deeper than tired, heavier than sleeplessness. It was the weight of knowing that no matter how hard he worked, he was always failing someone. At work, he was too slow, too old school, not aggressive enough. At home, he wasn't present enough for his father, wasn't available enough for his son, wasn't strong enough to hold it all together without cracking. People kept calling him a warrior, kept saying how impressed they were that he handled everything so well. Every compliment felt like a stone added to his back. His body had begun to rebel in small ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. Chest tightness that came without warning. Shortness of breath climbing stairs. Forgetting simple things. Where he parked, what day it was, whether he'd eaten. His back ached constantly from years of crawling under commercial refrigerators and lifting compressor units. Some nights, lying in bed, his heart would race for no reason, pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He'd tell himself it was just stress, just temporary, just something to push through. Then came the week everything collapsed at once. Monday, his car's transmission started slipping. Tuesday, Mason sent a text that sat in Jonah's stomach like a stone. "Do you even remember what grade I'm in?" Wednesday, Walter fell in the bathroom trying to reach his pills. Not a serious fall, but enough to require a trip to urgent care, waiting 4 hours in a fluorescent-lit room while his phone buzzed with messages from Chris about a cooler emergency at store 9. Thursday, Chris called at 7 in the morning demanding Jonah cover a shift for another technician who called in sick, which meant working a double, 20 hours straight. Friday, driving too fast between stores, Jonah got pulled over. The ticket was $300 he absolutely did not have. By Friday night, Jonah felt like a machine that had finally stopped functioning. He drove home in a daze, his hands shaking slightly on the wheel. The apartment was dark except for the television's blue glow. Walter was asleep in his recliner, mouth slightly open, glasses crooked on his face. The kitchen sink was full of dishes. Bills were stacked on the table, some of them red-stamped with final notice. His phone vibrated again. Chris. Another message about Monday's schedule. Jonah stood in the doorway between the living room and kitchen, and something inside him simply stopped. Not broke. Stopped. Like an engine that's been running too hot for too long and finally seizes. He walked to the kitchen, put his phone face down on the counter, and slowly sat down on the floor, his back against the cabinet. He pulled his knees up, rested his forehead on his arms, and did nothing. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just sat there, completely empty, as the phone kept buzzing, as the television kept flickering, as his father kept sleeping. For the first time in years, Jonah simply did not respond to anything. He didn't know how long he'd been sitting there when he heard the scrape of the walker on linoleum. Walter had woken up, noticed the silence, a silence different from the usual exhaustion, and made his way to the kitchen. The old man stood in the doorway, steadying himself with both hands on the walker, looking down at his son on the floor. Jonah? Walter's voice was rough with sleep and concern. When Jonah didn't respond, didn't even look up, something shifted in the old man's face. He navigated carefully to one of the kitchen chairs and lowered himself down with a grunt, leaving the walker beside him. They sat that way for a while, father in the chair, son on the floor, the refrigerator humming its eternal song. "I'm done," Jonah finally said, his voice muffled against his arms. "I can't do this anymore." Walter was quiet for a long moment. He'd always been a tough man, a factory worker who believed in toughing things out, in not complaining, in doing what needed to be done. He'd raised Jonah with those values, praised him for being strong, for not causing trouble. Now, looking at his son collapsed on the kitchen floor at 41 years old, Walter felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: regret. "Son," Walter said, and his voice was softer than Jonah had heard in years, maybe ever. "Look at me." Jonah raised his head slowly. His eyes were dry but hollow, the eyes of someone who'd given up not on life exactly, but on trying to hold life together with his bare hands. "Descanso também a seguir em frente," Walter said, the words coming in Portuguese, a language his own mother had spoken when he was a boy, words that surfaced from somewhere deep when English felt insufficient. Then, in English, resting is also moving forward. You're not lazy because you stopped. You're collapsing because you never stopped. The words hung in the air between them. Jonah stared at his father, this old man who had always demanded strength, always praised endurance, now giving him permission to rest. It felt like the floor had shifted beneath him. "I can't afford to rest," Jonah said, but his voice had no conviction. "If I stop, everything falls apart. The bills, your medication, the job. It's already falling apart," Walter interrupted gently. "And you're falling apart trying to hold it. What good is moving forward if you're dying while you do it?" Something cracked in Jonah's chest. Not his heart exactly, but something that had been holding it too tight. He felt tears come, silent and hot, sliding down his face as he sat on the cold kitchen floor. Walter didn't get up, didn't try to hug him. That wasn't who they were. But he stayed, and that was enough. "What am I supposed to do?" Jonah whispered. "Tomorrow," Walter said, "you call Dr. Ross. You tell her what's happening, and we figure this out together instead of you trying to be a damn superhero." Jonah wanted to argue, wanted to list all the reasons why he couldn't, why it wasn't that simple. But he was too tired, too empty. So instead, he just nodded. Morning came with its usual cruelty. Jonah woke on the couch, still in yesterday's work clothes, his phone dead beside him. For a moment, panic seized him. What time was it? What had he missed? Then he remembered the kitchen floor, his father's words, the permission to stop. The panic ebbed slightly, replaced by something unfamiliar, uncertainty about what came next. Walter was already up, making coffee with slow, deliberate movements. He nodded at Jonah when he came into the kitchen. No grand speeches, no checking if he was okay. Just, phones charged. Dr. Ross's office opens at 8. At 8:15, Jonah made the call. His hand shook slightly as he dialed. The receptionist was kind, efficient. Dr. Emily Ross could see him that afternoon at 2. Jonah almost said no. He'd have to miss work. Chris would be furious. There was so much to do. Then he felt Walter's eyes on him from across the room and heard himself say, "I'll be there." Calling in sick felt like committing a crime. Chris answered on the first ring, his voice already impatient. When Jonah said he needed the day off, there was a long silence. Then, "Jonah, we talked about this. The team needs reliability right now. Are you actually sick, or is this about?" "I'm seeing a doctor," Jonah said, cutting him off. "I'll be back when I can." He hung up before Chris could respond, his heart racing. He'd never done that before. Never prioritized his own health over the job's demands. It felt terrifying and, strangely, like taking a first breath after being underwater. The medical building was new, all glass and pale wood, filled with plants and natural light. Jonah sat in the waiting room feeling out of place in his work jacket, surrounded by people who looked like they had their lives together. When they called his name, he almost didn't stand. Dr. Ross's office was small and warm. She was in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back and eyes that actually looked at him, not through him. She asked him to sit, asked him how he was doing, and when Jonah opened his mouth to say fine, what came out instead was the truth. It spilled out in fragments. The hours, the crushing responsibility, the constant feeling of drowning, the chest pains, the sleeplessness, the sense that he was failing at everything simultaneously. Dr. Ross listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, her face neutral but attentive. When Jonah finally stopped talking, exhausted from the confession, she set down her pen and leaned forward slightly. "Jonah, what you're describing is severe burnout with symptoms of depression and anxiety. Your body isn't weak. It's trying desperately to protect you by shutting down." The relief of having it named, having it recognized as real rather than a failure of character, made Jonah's throat tight. "What do I do?" he asked. "First," Dr. Ross said, "we need to get you off the front lines. I'm recommending a medical leave from work. FMLA protects your job. You need at least 6 weeks, maybe more." "I can't, the bill's my dad." "You can't afford not to," she said firmly. "And we'll figure out the rest. There are programs, resources. But Jonah, if you keep going like this, you won't make it another 6 months. Your body is telling you that right now." She also recommended therapy, sleep hygiene protocols, and something that surprised him, a referral to a support group for caregivers. "You're not alone in this," she said. "That feeling that you have to do everything yourself? That's part of what's killing you." Walking out of her office with prescriptions and referral papers, Jonah felt strange. Not better exactly, but seen. Like someone had finally acknowledged that he was drowning and thrown him a rope instead of just shouting encouragement from the shore. The real transformation didn't happen in a single moment. It unfolded slowly over the following weeks, a series of small decisions that felt like betrayals of everything Jonah thought he was supposed to be. The hardest part was filing for medical leave. Chris responded with thinly veiled disappointment, suggesting Jonah was letting the team down and that everyone has stress. For a moment, Jonah almost backed down, almost said he could manage. Then he remembered sitting on the kitchen floor, remembered the hollow feeling of complete emptiness, and sent the paperwork anyway. The first week of leave was agony. Jonah didn't know how to just be. Without work structuring his days, time felt elastic and threatening. He'd wake up and immediately start looking for things to fix, organizing the kitchen, sorting through old bills, researching cheaper insurance options. Walter would watch him and finally say, "Sit down. You're on leave to rest, not to find new ways to exhaust yourself." "I don't know how to rest," Jonah admitted. "Then learn," Walter said. "Start with that chair." He pointed to his recliner, the old brown lazy boy that had been his throne for 20 years. Jonah had never sat in it. It felt sacred, off limits, like sitting in your father's chair was somehow disrespectful. "Today it's yours," Walter said, settling himself on the couch instead. "Sit. Watch TV. Do nothing." Doing nothing was excruciating. Jonah sat in the recliner, feeling the worn leather conform to his body, and his mind immediately started screaming about waste, about laziness, about all the things he should be doing. But Walter was watching a cooking show, seemingly at peace, and something about his father's calm presence made Jonah stay. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Slowly, almost against his will, Jonah's breathing deepened. His shoulders, which had been up around his ears for months, lowered slightly. This became their ritual. Every afternoon, Walter would say, "Your turn for the chair," and Jonah would sit. At first, it was torture. Then it was uncomfortable. Then, slowly, it became a small island of permission in a sea of obligation. The recliner became a symbol. When Jonah was in it, he was allowed to just exist. No fixing, no problem solving, no being strong. Just being. The therapy sessions were another threshold. Jonah's therapist, Marcus, was a soft-spoken man who didn't push but didn't let Jonah deflect either. In their third session, Marcus asked a simple question that broke something open. "When was the last time someone took care of you?" Jonah couldn't answer. He realized, with a shock, that he couldn't remember. Even as a child, he'd been the responsible one, the helper, the one who didn't cause trouble. Being needed had become his identity. Being cared for felt foreign, almost dangerous. "What if," Marcus said carefully, "being strong isn't always about carrying everything? What if sometimes it's about knowing when to set things down?" The caregiver support group met on Thursday evenings in a church basement. Jonah almost didn't go to the first meeting. He sat in his car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, convincing himself it was stupid, that he didn't need it. Then a woman knocked on his window, 50-ish, kind eyes, carrying a coffee thermos. "First time?" she asked. When he nodded, she smiled. "Come on. We've all sat in our cars the first time." Inside were 8 other people, all caring for aging parents or sick spouses, all carrying the same exhausted weight in their faces. As they went around the circle sharing their weeks, Jonah felt something unfamiliar: recognition. These people understood. They knew about the guilt, the impossible choices, the feeling of never being enough. When it was his turn to speak, Jonah's voice cracked as he said, "I thought I was supposed to be able to handle this." A man across the circle, maybe 10 years older, said gently, "None of us can handle it alone. That's the secret they don't tell you." The real test came when the leave period was halfway over and Jonah started to feel slightly better. Not healed, but less like he was actively dying. That's when the old voice came back. The voice that said this rest thing was self-indulgent, that he should be able to just snap out of it and get back to normal life. The voice that said real men didn't need this much help, that he was being weak. Chris called one afternoon, ostensibly to check in. What followed was a carefully worded pressure campaign. The team was struggling. The new hire wasn't working out. They really needed Jonah back. "I know you're dealing with stuff," Chris said, "but we all have challenges, you know. Part of being a professional is showing up anyway." Jonah felt the familiar pull, the hook in his chest that said he was abandoning his responsibilities. He almost said yes, almost cut the leave short, almost proved he wasn't weak by diving back into the drowning. Instead, he said, "I'll be back when my doctor clears me," and hung up with shaking hands. That night, sitting in the recliner, Jonah broke down. "Maybe I am being weak," he said to Walter. "Maybe I should just toughen up." Walter was quiet for a long time. Then he said something Jonah had never heard before. "I'm sorry." "For what?" for teaching you that stopping means failing, for making you think that being a man means never needing help. Your mother tried to tell me I was too hard, that you needed permission to be human. I didn't listen. Walter's voice was rough. And now I see you breaking yourself the way I broke myself, and I can't. He stopped, collected himself. You're not weak for resting. You're finally smart enough to stop killing yourself. Don't make my mistakes. The apology, unexpected and raw, shifted something fundamental. Jonah realized he'd been trying to live up to a standard even his father now regretted setting. What if the whole framework was wrong? What if strength wasn't about endurance, but about wisdom? The turning point came during a panic attack at 2 in the morning. Jonah woke with his heart racing, chest tight, convinced he was having a heart attack. Walter heard him gasping in the bathroom and came in with the walker. "Tell me 5 things you can see," Walter said calmly. It was a grounding technique from a caregiver guide someone at the support group had shared. Jonah looked around. Toothbrush, blue towel, cracked tile, soap dispenser, his father's worried face. 5 things you can touch. The sink's cool porcelain, his cotton shirt, the wall's texture, the walker's rubber grip, Walter's hand as his father reached out. Slowly, the panic subsided. They sat on the bathroom floor together, an old man and a middle-aged son, both broken in different ways, both learning that vulnerability wasn't weakness but a doorway to actual help. "The chair rule applies everywhere," Walter said finally. "When your body says stop, you stop. No debate." 7 weeks into his leave, Jonah had his follow-up appointment with Dr. Ross. She reviewed his progress: sleeping better, panic attacks less frequent, weight stabilizing. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Terrified," Jonah admitted. "I'm supposed to go back to work next week, and I don't know if I can do it without falling apart again." "Then don't do it the same way," Dr. Ross said simply. "You're medically cleared to return, but that doesn't mean returning to the same patterns. You'll need accommodations, limited overtime, regular breaks, firm boundaries. Your health isn't negotiable." The idea of setting boundaries at work felt impossible. But Marcus, in their session that week, put it differently. "You've been giving 150% and destroying yourself. What if you gave 80% and stayed alive? What serves everyone better?" Jonah realized the revelation wasn't a single insight, but a fundamental reorganization of priorities. For years, he'd operated under the belief that his worth was measured by how much he could endure, how much he could sacrifice, how much he could carry alone. That belief had nearly killed him. The new understanding was simpler and harder. His worth was inherent, not earned. His life mattered even when he wasn't useful. Resting wasn't the opposite of progress. It was the foundation that made progress sustainable. He thought about the recliner, that humble brown chair that had become a teacher. It had shown him that stopping didn't mean the world ended. The world kept turning. His father survived. The dishes eventually got done. And Jonah, when he allowed himself to rest, had the energy to actually show up as a human being rather than a depleted machine. "I think," Jonah said slowly to Marcus, "I've been confusing motion with movement. I was always doing something, but I wasn't actually getting anywhere. I was just wearing myself down. And now I'm learning that sometimes you have to stop moving to actually move forward." Returning to work was strange. The stores were the same. The equipment still broke. The pace was still relentless. But Jonah was different. He'd negotiated terms with HR before coming back. No overtime without 48 hours notice. No contact after hours except emergencies. Reduced territory coverage. Chris wasn't happy about it, but the company had liability concerns after the medical leave documentation. The first week, Jonah had to actively resist old patterns. When Chris asked him to just quickly cover an extra shift, Jonah's instinct was to say yes. Instead, he said, "Not this week," and felt his chest tighten with guilt and anxiety. He called Marcus afterward. "I feel like I'm letting people down." "You're teaching them that you're a human, not a resource to be extracted," Marcus said. "That's not letting anyone down. That's modeling health." Jonah started small rituals to maintain the boundaries. Every day at lunch, instead of eating while driving, he parked at a small park near one of the stores and sat for 30 minutes. Just sat. Sometimes he'd close his eyes. Sometimes he'd watch people walking dogs. It felt wildly indulgent at first, then necessary, then sacred. At home, the recliner ritual continued. Some days Jonah still resisted it, still felt the pull to be productive every waking moment. But Walter would just gesture at the chair, and Jonah would sit, and the sitting became its own form of meditation. He started reading again, something he'd given up years ago, working through novels one chapter at a time. The relationship with Mason slowly rebuilt. Instead of rushed, guilty phone calls, Jonah started scheduling weekly video chats where he was actually present, not exhausted and distracted. Mason noticed. "You seem different, Dad," he said one night. "I'm trying to be less of a zombie," Jonah said. "It's good. You seem like you." 3 months after returning to work, Jonah attended his support group and shared something that felt like a victory. "I said no to a Sunday shift this week, and I didn't feel guilty. Or I felt guilty for about 5 minutes, and then I sat in my recliner and it passed." The group laughed knowingly. The woman who'd first invited him in said, "That's the work. That's what healing looks like." 6 months post-leave, Jonah's life wasn't perfect. Bills were still tight. Work was still demanding. Walter's health had ups and downs. But something fundamental had shifted. Jonah had learned to recognize the warning signs, the chest tightness, the racing thoughts, the feeling of being spread too thin, and he had tools now. Most importantly, he had given himself permission to use them. The final moment of the story comes on a particularly brutal day at work. Everything that could go wrong did. A freezer-complete failure, a flooded stockroom, a verbal confrontation with a store manager who blamed Jonah for corporate cost-cutting. By the time he got home, Jonah could feel the old panic building, the sense of being overwhelmed and inadequate. He walked into the apartment, saw the familiar scene. Dishes in the sink, bills on the table, Walter in the recliner watching the news. His body tensed automatically, his mind starting to catalog everything that needed to be done, everyone he was failing. Then he felt it, the tightness in his chest, the shortness of breath, the first whisper of the voice that said he should just keep pushing. Jonah stopped in the middle of the living room. He closed his eyes and heard, clear as a memory, his father's voice from that night on the kitchen floor. "Resting is also moving forward." He opened his eyes, looked at Walter, and said, "I need the chair tonight." Walter smiled. This old man who'd given his son the greatest gift he could, permission to be human. "It's all yours." Jonah sat in the recliner, leaned back, and let his body settle into the worn leather. The dishes would wait. The bills would get paid tomorrow. The world wouldn't end because he took 30 minutes to breathe. He felt the tension slowly leave his shoulders, felt his breathing deepen, felt the difference between giving up and giving himself grace. This wasn't the end of his challenges. Tomorrow would bring new pressures, new problems, new temptations to slip back into old patterns. But tonight, Jonah was learning the most subversive truth of his life, that rest wasn't laziness, that stopping wasn't failing, that sometimes the most courageous thing you could do was simply sit down. Outside, Minneapolis winter pressed against the windows. Inside, a middle-aged man sat in his father's chair and practiced the radical act of being gentle with himself. He wasn't fixed. He wasn't perfect. But he was, for the first time in years, actually alive. And that, Jonah was learning, was more than enough. This story reminds us that rest isn't the opposite of progress. It's the foundation that makes progress possible. Sometimes we confuse constant motion with actual movement, wearing ourselves down while going nowhere. What burden are you still carrying that you could set down today? Which part of your life is screaming for permission to rest? If this story touched something deep in you, write the word rest in the comments. Let me know you stayed until the end. Share what city you're watching from. Your journey might inspire someone else. Subscribe and hit the bell because every week I share stories that can transform how you see yourself and your struggles. And remember, sometimes stopping isn't giving up. Sometimes it's the only way to keep going.